Good afternoon. This is the North Carolina Professional Educator Preparation and Standards Commission meeting. Ms. Edwards, would you please call the roll?
Dr. Blanton,
Present.
Chair Bullock,
Present.
Ms. Edwards, present. Dr. Elliott, Dr. Fleming,
Present.
Dr. Graham, Vice Chair Griffin,
Present.
Ms. Hoskins,
Present.
Ms. Jenkins,
Present.
Ms. Jones,
Present.
Dr. Locklear,
Present.
Ms. Patton,
Present.
Dr. Penfield,
Present.
Mr. Smith,
Present.
Superintendent Truitt, Dr. Weddington, Ms. Wisner,
Present.
and Dr. Winter.
Present.
Thank you, Madison. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome commission members, advisors, staff, online visitors, and online listeners to the April 11th, 2024 monthly meeting of the North Carolina Professional Educator Preparation and Standards Commission. This Standards Commission develops and recommends to the State Board of Education rules related to all aspects of educator preparation, licensure, continuing education, and professional standards of North Carolina educators. I am Ann Bullock, Chair of the Professional Educator Preparation and Standards Commission, and I call this meeting to order. Our agenda and materials are available online through the DPI website, www.northcarolinapublicschools.org, on the SBE meetings link. The meeting is also audio streamed through a link located at the bottom of the e-board agenda. I will now read the ethics statement that is required of us. Commission members are reminded that it is our duty to avoid conflicts of interest and the appearance of conflicts of interest as we handle the work of this commission. Does any member of the commission know of any conflict of interest or any appearance of conflict of interest with respect to any matters coming before us at this meeting? If so, please state them for the record. If during the course of the meeting you become aware of an actual or apparent conflict of interest, please bring this matter to the attention of the Vice Chair. It will then be your duty to abstain from participating in discussion on the matter and from voting on the matter. Commission members, you have had the opportunity to review the proposed agenda for today's meeting. Do I have a motion to approve this agenda for the April 11th, 2024 meeting?
So moved.
Thank you, Ms. Jones.
Second.
Thank you, Dr. Winter. Any further discussion? All those in favor of approving the agenda for today's meeting, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
I'm not used to
Aye.
that.
Aye.
Thank you. I'm not used to doing this in person. This is I gotta get used to
It's a
this.
little different.
Yeah. The meetings from our previous commission meetings are on March 14th, 2024, have been prepared and made available to you. Do I have a motion to approve these minutes?
So moved.
Thank you. Dr. Griffin?
Second.
Thank you, Dr. Blanton. Any further discussion? All those in favor of approving the minutes from March 14, 2024, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
The link for the March SBE meeting has been sent to you prior to this meeting. The recording is bookmarked at the presentations for the Educator Standards and Practices, ES&P Committee, which is the committee that handles the work of Pepsi. If anyone has questions, please let Dr. Evans know, and we will follow up during the May Pepsi meeting. Now, Dr. Kim Evans will present policy amendments to License 003, licensure testing requirements for discussion and action.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me online?
Yes, we can.
Yes, Dr. Evans.
And
Excellent. So this afternoon, I'm presenting vendor updated licensure exams that are content-based. And so I just want to explain, vendor updates is where the content examination has been updated according to standards that have been updated in the field or based on recommendations from the field. And what happens with those recommendations is that a test is put together based on, around those updated standards, and then a standard study happens for each of these tests. So I want to give that background that these tests are new according to updated standards, and they don't, so the cut score does not have anything to do with the current test, that they are individual and alone according to this updated test. And so there are 3 tests that are being updated. And I'm just gonna scroll down. The first one is the secondary social studies. And so the current test is 5081. And that would be effective until August 31st, 2025. And then licensure would have a holdover for 3 years after that to accept that test with the cut score of 158. And then the updated test would be 5581, and that would be effective beginning September 1st, 2024, with a cut score of 153. And you can see that it meets multiple areas in secondary social studies. So it focuses on the anthropology piece, economics, geography, history, political science, the comprehensive social studies licensure area, and sociology. So there are multiple areas that it covers. And this is also what the current test is doing as well. Any questions about that particular test? Okay. So the second and third test are CTE tests, and CTE has looked at both of these tests, seeing how it was standard studied, and in fact, someone from North Carolina was able to represent the panel for that standard study, and also the changes around the standards themselves. So the first test for career technical education is Family and Consumer Sciences. The current test is 5122 with a cut score of 153. It's also effective until August 31st, 2025. And then the updated test would be 5123 with a cut score of 151, effective beginning September 1st, 2024. And then the third test, or the second CTE test, is Technology Education. 5051 is the current test with a cut score of 159. And it's effective until also August 31st, 2025. And then the updated test is 5053 with a cut score of 157. And the effective date would be beginning September 1st, 2024. Any questions about that?
So I just want to make a statement about that we're following the same protocol that we've done with other,
Yes, that is
other
correct.
licensure tests where you have a year overlap.
Yes, yes.
Any questions?
Yeah, one question. Is the effective date the date of when the student takes the test or when they apply?
They could take the test beginning that date.
Okay.
Yes.
Dr. Tomberlin?
Yeah, I just want to make sure that, that we present this with clarity to the field, that those effective dates would be related to the application for the license date. So as long as you apply before September 1st, August 31st, 2025, you could use the old test. We don't get the impression that if I take the test today and then go do a program and in 2026, I say, oh wait, but I took the test back then. It really goes to the date of the application that we will accept that test with an application on that date. So I just wanted, and we probably should do a little more in the LIC in 003 to clarify that condition.
But that's also, so if it sits in licensure because of the workload, you're not penalized as well.
That's correct.
Yes. No. Okay. Any other questions? I also think it's not available after a certain point from the ETS side, like they do a good
But
job of.
licensure still accepts it for 3 years after the expiration date of when it was effective.
What does that mean?
So for 5051, the technology education test, it would be effective until August 31st, so offered August 31st, 2025. But licensure will still accept it until August 31st, 2028
That's
for.
not what I understood him to just say. Him being Dr. Tomberlin.
So let us clarify this with licensure staff. I don't, my feeling is when we set these dates, that is the date of the application that governs which test would be. So anybody taking the test between August 31st, 2025, or September 1st, 2024, and August 31st, 2025, whichever test they took would be applicable. But once the effective date runs out, those applications coming after would have to conform to the new test. Now, on the 3-year rule, I do need to check with, let me get some clarity from licensure, and I can get that before we're done today for you.
Okay. Well, shall we just table this for now? Let's just table this for now, we'll come back. We want everybody to work during our meeting, so thank you, Dr. Tomberlin. Okay, so, all right, so we're gonna table that, we'll just leave that alone for now, we will come back to that. I would say that, the concern there would be for residency teachers, right? So if they took that test, and that's how they became eligible to be a residency, teacher, and then they don't finish their program for 3 years, maybe, I think that may be something to consider. We don't wanna penalize people.
I will say, even with traditional undergraduate candidates, we often get asked, well, can I take whichever test I want? And so we always share those dates there that you
Yeah.
need to understand when it.
I think when they're in a traditional, what we can, and I think the ETS site does a good job of saying, this test is only through here, so, but I do think that would be great clarity just in general, so thank you. All right, we'll move on, to Mr. Collins. So Ryan Collins, Assistant General Counsel for the State Board of Education, will present policy amendments to license 007, which is around licensure, suspension, and revocation. EVAL 014, which is the Code of Ethics for North Carolina educators, and EVAL 035, which are the Standards of Professional Conduct. You may not recognize him because we are in person mostly today, but Mr. Collins has presented this before and is coming back with a bit of an amendment, I would say. Is that a fair, that may not be a fair term.
Yes, I'll attempt to articulate it as best as I can.
Okay.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. As Chair Bullock said, I'm Ryan Collins. I'm one of the attorneys with the State Board of Education and DPI. Last time I appeared before you was in January when I brought proposed revisions to the Standards of Professional Conduct as well as the rules that govern the licensure discipline process. And so the first thing that I want to touch on is a little bit about what's happened with those rules since January. So I invite you to go on a journey with me through the North Carolina Administrative Procedure Act, which is something that I pray most of you never have to think too much about. So you all recommended those rules back in January. The State Board then considered and approved those rules at or December, I believe it was actually, and then the State Board proposed those rules formally in January. They went through a public notice and comment period, and then the State Board formally adopted the rules at its meeting in March. At that point, because these are administrative rules subject to the APA, they then had to be reviewed by what's called the Rules Review Commission, which is an agency that reviews or an institution that reviews agency rules, not just State Board, but DHHS, DEQ, all these different agencies to ensure that they are clear, that they are statutorily authorized, etc. In the course of that, fortunately, they were perfectly fine and approved most of those rules that the board adopted on y'all's recommendation. Unfortunately, there was one provision in the Standards of Professional Conduct that proved to be a sticking point, and it is the one that is highlighted in green on the screen. It may not be super legible up there, but it is in your materials. And this has to do with a standard about personal conduct. So just to give a little bit of background, this is a provision that's been in the standards since they were first adopted in 1998. It is based on language from a 1984 North Carolina Supreme Court case called Faulkner that talks about sort of the expectations of professional educators to be held to a higher standard of conduct than the average citizen because of the role they play in their communities. So I wrote a pretty lengthy legal analysis. I went and presented to the ROC in person, tried to persuade them that I thought that this standard was sufficiently clear and was appropriate to be implemented. Unfortunately, they did object, as is their statutory right, based on concerns that it was too vague or impermissibly vague. So for that reason, the entirety of this particular rule, the Standards of Professional Conduct, has not yet been changed, so we're still operating off of the existing rule that we've had since 1998. But in order for for the rest of the changes to go forward, we had to figure out a way to address this particular objection. So we've consulted internally, and as I shared with the chair and vice chair previously, our recommendation is actually going to be to just remove this provision. And let me give you a little more context. Ultimately, what the rulemaking process is about in this case is making these rules legally enforceable. So if a teacher violates standards of professional conduct and the superintendent in her discretion determines that that action is worthy of having their license suspended or revoked entirely, having these go through the rulemaking process is what makes that a legally enforceable decision, should they challenge it through judicial review or the Office of Administrative Hearings. There are other provisions in our view, in the Office of General Counsel's view, that would address the type of conduct that's normally addressed by this. For example, there's a separate provision in a different rule that says the license can be revoked for, quote, illegal, unethical, or lascivious conduct, and that has been approved, so we are of the view that that would be sufficient to address the type of conduct that this would otherwise capture, and that trying to write, I think, more specific language for this particular rule that would satisfy the ROC would just be an onerous task and would, continue to drag this out. So we are of the view that this provision could simply be removed without significantly impeding the work of the board or of the superintendent. We also, now that isn't to say that the board aren't still recommending or the board isn't still expecting teachers to have high standards of personal character and conduct, but what we're suggesting instead is that that be used as sort of aspirational language in the policy that I'm going to talk about in a minute. So sort of the first piece of this is saying we're going to recommend that the board simply take this, that the state board simply take this provision out in order to ensure that the rest of the rule can go forward. So that's the first piece of this. I know it's a little bit technical, but I'd be happy to answer questions if the commissioners have any.
Any pause from our P12 reps?
So the highlighted language that's stricken through, is that what's being removed or the entire highlight?
So in the original text, what has been stricken through was what was the old language, and then we basically were just, what had originally proposed was just sort of rewording that to, I think, read a little bit more grammatically clear for our English teachers in the room. And so the proposal is simply to take the number 2 out entirely. So it would be recognize professional standards, and then number 2 would be conduct with students. That would be the new proposal.
But this is covered in other aspects that can be pulled into, as you
Correct.
alluded to. Okay.
And can you point out where it is covered, Mr. Collins?
I can show you the language when we get to LICN 007.
That'd be helpful, I think. I asked for the PSU reps to make sure, because one of the things we discussed in our planning meeting was that sometimes this area is used in important personnel decisions. So just to be
Well, is
clear.
it gonna be a part of licensure policy? Because if that's the case, it's then tied to the license too, correct? That makes sense? Meaning, when, as a school district, if we're having to meet with an employee, even though we may move on from that employee because of personal conduct, is this now gonna tie it to licensure where it gives school districts a little more teeth there, I think, for individuals that are breaking the code.
Sure. And so, I mean, obviously, PSUs still have their own internal policies, and they have their own separate statutory guidelines as well as policies that they can rely on. I don't know that removing this from the standards of professional conduct takes away, because ultimately it's the state board that enforces these standards, not the PSUs. And so,
Right, so when they get up here for an issue, this is still taken in consideration anyway, I guess, yeah.
through a different avenue, which I'll speak to when we look at LSCN 007.
Any questions on this part?
I mean, I think I agree with Vice Chair Griffin. If it's covered somewhere else, I don't know that I see a huge problem removing it.
All right.
So, Dr. Evans, if we could go to eval 035. So, at this point, we're going to transition to talking about what I consider to just simply be conforming changes to the state board's policies. So, as I mentioned, these are administrative rules. These are what give the board the legal authority to enforce its policies, essentially. But the internal board policies are still what you all are used to seeing, and it covers not only things that are required to be in rules, but sort of more comprehensive matters like testing requirements, things like that. And so when we look at, and so part of what this started at was simply updating state board's policies to conform to these changes. So with eval 005, basically this is essentially a new policy. It's taking the standards of professional conduct out of eval 014 where they were previously, and just separating them into their own policy for organizational purposes. So when you look at this, this is the exact same language that appears in the rule, except now you see that personal conduct has been taken out as item number 2. There's sort of an introductory statement there that just sets forth some of the same language from the rule. And so what I'm recommending is, if you scroll all the way down to the bottom, Dr. Evans, is that I've taken that rule and reworded it as sort of aspirational language at the end of the rule, so that this is still here. And it's still part of the state board's policy, which means it's not subject to RRC approval. So it's not necessarily a legally enforceable standard from the state board's perspective, but it is still making clear that the state board expects individuals to conduct themselves personally. And I think this is still language that, that PSUs could cite as the type of expectations in their own internal processes, not necessarily as legal grounds, because you all still have statutory specific laws that govern how teachers are disciplined at the local level, but it is still language that's available as kind of a statement of the board's position. So that's my recommendation, is how we can still make the board's point on this clear, but it's through a policy statement rather than through the rule itself.
And just to clarify, and I think that's fine, this can still be held as a standard for someone going through the, I don't know the right word, discipline hearing, if you will, so that if when they submit to the state board and you're requiring the paperwork to determine if they keep their license or not, I mean, this is still, this ethics statement, or I forgot now what we're calling this. What's this section right?
It's just it's a policy statement. It's
Policy.
Policy, okay. But that can still be used in a situation of where a teacher's coming up here, I say coming up here, but where they're having to defend keeping their license, so to speak.
Right.
You
So
can still use
so
that
this
again.
this language is actually pretty standard in all of our suspension and revocation orders. We still cite specific provisions from the standards of professional conduct and from
Yeah.
what will now be LSCN 07 as grounds for revocation.
I just don't want to
So-
wait for someone who's done something bad in an LEA to come up here, or PSU, come up here, and this can no longer be used as a part of that. I guess that's where I'm going with it.
Sure.
So that personal conduct piece that was in number 2 has been stricken through, but is alluded to here in the policy itself, so that it could be reflected if need be, that their personal conduct and the standard in which we hold them to, making sure that is relevant when working with employees. Is that correct?
Yes.
I believe there is a word missing in the first sentence. The SBE expects blank to serve as positive role models in their community.
Yes. That word educator should be in there. So thank you for catching that. We'll make sure we get that edited.
I'm one of those English teacher friends.
Well, Ms. Jones gets me every time. So yeah. If there's no further questions about this, we can.
Any?
or-
Sir, are there any other? Okay, keep moving. Thank you.
So if you look at eval 014, this was where this is the code of ethics. So this has actually been around, the first part of this at least has been around a year longer, since 1997. And as best I can tell, when the standards of professional conduct were passed, they were copied and pasted into the bottom of this policy. So as I've said, we've recommended taking those out. And the remainder of the edits in here are just simply kind of grammatical and technical fixes. There's no substantive changes in there.
Is everyone clear about what Mr. Collins is asking and we've been through this once, but this is again, like a little amendment based on feedback. Any further questions for Mr. Collins?
And that does just leave the one last policy, which is LICN 007. And all of this is that it is updating the existing policy, and just, it's a technical matter. It was easier just to strike out all the old stuff and replace it with the new stuff. And all this has done is taken all the other rules that have been recommended, adopted, and approved by RC and pulls them into this policy. It also incorporates the delegation of authority. As the rule says, it's the state board, but the state board has internally delegated that superintendent, so that reflects that internal delegation of authority to make these decisions. It also incorporates the automatic revocation statute, which with rulemaking, you don't repeat things that are in statute, but with policy, you can. So this provides a comprehensive policy that includes all of the state board's discretionary authority when it comes to revoking license, as well as the automatic revocation statute for when an individual is convicted of certain types of felonies.
Everybody good? Anyone online that's joining us online have any questions for Mr. Collins or any clarification needed? All right. Thank you.
All right. Thank you all for your time.
Okay, given that we have no more questions, do I have a motion to approve the policy amendments to license 007? I'm gonna call it eval, E-V-A-L, eval 014, 014 and eval 035 that discuss standards of professional conduct, the code of ethics for North Carolina educators, and the disciplinary process and sanctions for North Carolina educators to be sent to the State Board of Education in May. So I'm seeking a motion.
So moved.
Thank you, Dr. Penfield.
Second?
Thank you, Ms. Hoskins.
Point of clarification, so the motion includes adding that word educators to the,
So the motion would, yes. Thank you. We can amend the motion. We need to. Do we need to amend the motion, Kim, to add the word educators?
Sure, you can say that.
Okay. All of what I said before and add the word educators. Is that okay? I can repeat it if I need to. So,
So moved.
okay, thank you. Second on my revised. Do we have to vote on the, I don't want us to get out of technical problems. Actually, we're supposed to vote on the first motion. So let's vote on the first motion, which was incorrect. Just saying that before you vote. Okay, so for the first motion that I read, which doesn't include the word educators, all those in favor? All those against? Say aye. Any abstentions? Okay, so do I have a motion to approve the policy amendments to license 007, eval 014, and eval 035 that discusses standards of professional conduct, the code of ethics for North Carolina educators, and the disciplinary process and sanctions for North Carolina educators and including the word educator in the blank for, which one is it for, Mr. Collins?
It's here, eval 035.
Eval 035 to be sent to the State Board of Education in May.
So moved.
Thank you, Dr. Penfield.
Second?
Thank you, Ms. Hoskins. Any further discussion? All those in favor of the revised motion, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
Aye.
Thank you.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, motion passes. Thank you, Mr. Collins. Dr. Tomberlin, let's go back to license 003 for our point of clarification.
Yes, so the 3-year sunset is a matter procedure within our licensure department. It's not in the policy. That's where I got kind of thrown there. So yes, they do provide a 3-year sunset. Licensure will accept that 3 years after the end of the effective date of the original test, but the new test is in effect as of the date listed there. So we're good.
All right. Any questions or further clarification on that? All right, so going back to that, to this agenda item around license 003, do I have a motion to approve the policy amendments to license 0303 that recommends the following vendor updated test: secondary social studies test 5581, family and consumer sciences test 5123, and technology education test 5053 to be sent to the State Board of Education in May.
So moved.
Thank you, Dr. Blanton.
Second.
Thank you, Dr. Aaron. Any further, Dr. Fleming, sorry, any further discussion? All those who are in favor of this motion, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Any abstentions? All right, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Evans. And thank you, Dr. Tomberlin. So we've done licensure 003, we've done licensure 007, et cetera, et cetera. Now we're gonna have a short update about where we are with principal preparation work. This is not something that's coming to us for a vote this month. It will come next month. That is the hope, or actually, it will come next month. So Dr. Tomberlin, if we could have your update, that'd be great.
Thank you, Chair Bullock, and it's nice to know that you are all real people and not CGI-generated
Exactly.
heads on a screen. So I'm here to provide some updates on principal preparation, licensure, and evaluation. And I want to preface this with kind of the statutory foundation for this work. This is grounded in Session Law 2023-125, which created some changes to 115C 284.1, which is our principal preparation section of the statutes. In Section 2, the General Assembly directs the Professional Educator Preparation and Standards Commission, in consultation with the Department of Public Instruction and the North Carolina Principal Fellows Commission, to develop a portfolio-based assessment for use in applications for administrator licensure. So that is the charge that is before you as PEPC, and you shall make those recommendations to the State Board for approval by June 15th, 2024. So in this work of consultation with the North Carolina Principal Fellows Commission, DPI has assembled a task force to address the issues of the principal standards and other elements of the principal licensure process. So for the standards first, the standards have not been updated in North Carolina since 2008, and that was done under Race to the Top. So there were a lot of resources, a lot of work that went into that, a lot of training that went into that. But here, 15 years later, we recognized that those standards should probably be revisited. Additionally, that work that was done in 2008 on revising principal standards, there was a lot of work done with the State Board of Education in relation to policy, and there was language in statute that directed the State Board to do that work. What we've discovered is that the legislation never closed the loop on that great work that was done at that time. So that put us in the position of the State Board recommended that we move to a portfolio-based system, and that was all approved by the State Board, but for some reason the legislation never was updated to allow those changes, and so that put us in the position that we're in now. Back in 2019, our former colleague, Dr. Robert Sachs, started working with folks to update and align these principal standards with the National Professional Standards for Educator Leadership, or the PEASL standards. And that work has been picked up by our current task force, who continue to refine those standards and align them with the national standards. On the portfolio-based assessment system, DPI looked and we considered all available portfolio assessment systems that were being used in the country, and that is precious few, but we looked at all of them. And we narrowed our consideration down to those valid and reliable instruments that most closely match the needs of North Carolina. In the process of adjusting that language, we have to do it in a way that doesn't compromise the validity or reliability of the underlying assessment. So it's so think of it as just like tinkering around the margins. We can't dig in and fundamentally change what a task is, because that would change the inferences related to the validity and reliability of the instrument. So what we're having to do is work with the vendor to say, how far can we push on this, and then what's the point at which we have to say it has to stay that way. So we are on track to present that final recommendation to Pepsi in May. So of course, I'm sure all of you are wondering, what were the criteria we used to identify an assessment that would be good for North Carolina? And so to assist with that, I'm going to call on my colleague, Ms. Erin Larkin-McGuire, to kind of walk through those criteria that we used.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Fantastic. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to be with you and to share some of this great work. As Dr. Tomberlin mentioned, I've been working with the DPI team to help shepherd the work of this task force, and so I wanted to give you some context on the criteria that have been driving our research. So you can see on the slide, they're broken into two big buckets. First, pedagogical, most important. Second, practical, which can't be ignored. We need to commit to a feasible strategy. So just to walk you through at a very high level, these key criteria. So first, criteria A, their alignment, that we need to land on a recommendation that aligns with and meaningfully assesses North Carolina's principal standards. We can't just pick a strategy that aligns any vision for principal leadership. It needs to be North Carolina's vision. It needs to meaningfully align. Criteria B, EPP flexibility. Current state, there's a wide range of strategies for assessing principal candidates at the EPP level in practice. The goal of this shift in policy was not to build 100% alignment in what those EPPs are doing. The goal is to preserve flexibility and some EPP autonomy in how they design their programs. So we don't want to commit to a strategy that's overly rigid in its assessment design. C, scope. So one of the big shifts from a test-based strategy to a portfolio-based strategy is that we can't assign a question to every standard. The goal for the portfolio is that we get meaningful coverage of the standards. And in fact, we want to preview for this group that we've found that it's unlikely that any performance-based assessment can cover every single standard and still be feasible and cost-effective. And in our collaboration with both Pearson and ETS, we grilled them quite significantly to get underneath the work that they've done. And they've been very clear that in all the work that they've done, that some standards lend themselves more effectively to portfolio-based assessment than others, whereas other standards are most appropriately assessed through coursework or internship requirements. And that has been also backed up by the input of our task force thus far. Criteria D, Dr. Tomlin already referenced this, but validity and reliability. We want to commit to a tool that's valid for use in the field. There's a strong database there already, so that the state can leverage that data for continuous improvement in a range of ways, which they are not able to do current state. And then E, user experience. We want it to be well designed. We want candidates to take this assessment and say, that made sense. I knew what to do. I was set up for success. That it's clear and manageable and a good user experience. So those are some of the pedagogical criteria. And we have to be thoughtful about the practical criteria here. So one, as is already the context of this conversation, is the timeline. We needed to commit to a strategy that would enable Pepsi to meet the requirement in statute to get a recommendation to the state board by June 15th. And as Dr. Tomberlin indicated, we are on track to meet that requirement. B, cost to candidates. Current state, in the way that EPPs are operationalized in portfolios, there is no standardized cost to a candidate to complete the portfolio. That's very different than all other aspects of educator licensure across the state right now. And as North Carolina recommits to a centralized strategy and commits to a new approach to portfolio-based assessment, there will be a cost to candidates, and the goal was to ensure that that cost was commensurate with other required licensure areas. We did not want to commit to a strategy that felt out of line with other approaches to licensure, and we are also on track to meet this recommendation as well. The budget. The statute did not come with attached funds, and so this approach here needs to be budget neutral. There was not an infusion of resources to do the research, and so it needs to be, nor to operationalize it ongoing. And so it has to be that this strategy doesn't require significant upfront financial investment to stand it up, nor annual budget allocation to maintain it. That relates, and I'm going to jump over D to E, and I'll come back to D. That's a heavy feature for why E matters as well, scoring capacity. Similar to the EdTPA, where teacher candidates take the portfolio-based assessment and then it is scored by a centralized entity, and the cost of that scoring is supported by the candidate's assessment registration fee. That needs to be true here as well, because North Carolina does not have, as we already noted, built-in budget, nor capacity, nor human capacity to score. That's a massive undertaking year over year. And so the goal is to be parallel with what teachers are already experiencing. And then finally, D, the ability to customize. As Dr. Tomlin alluded already, we wanted to pick a strategy or recommend a strategy to this body that from which the validity and reliability was clearly established, and there was an opportunity to make it a North Carolina specific assessment, so that it felt reflective of the state's needs and context. And so the task force has been using these criteria to review and reflect on the limited tools that exist in the field, but we're also confident that we're going to be able to bring a recommendation that meets these criteria and that will fulfill both the spirit and the requirement of the statute going forward.
Great, thank you, Erin. I appreciate that. So our approach to identifying the assessments, just to give you just a brief synopsis of that, we did in our scan of the national landscape of which states partnered with a vendor to develop a performance portfolio-based assessment. We found 5 states. And the vendors are represented there, 2 with Pearson, 2 with ETS, and 1 with Bloomboard, to build their own portfolio assessments. One state assessment did emerge as being the favorite, but it definitely needed adjustment for the North Carolina context. So we also talked about, in our decision making, we impressed upon the task force that DPI had no budget to support a customized instrument, and that may be the desire of all, but there, the support for that desire was not there. We also have a very short time frame, June 15th, 2024. There's no way we could have developed a customized assessment in that time frame. Again, no assessment will measure everything. This assessment certainly doesn't measure all 8 standards, 7 standards of the principal evaluation process or the principal standards, but no. Our argument would be that no assessment does that. And as an illustration of that point, you just approved test 5081 for social studies, but it also covers economics, it covers sociology, it covers other areas, and there's no expectation that that test has every standard of all those disparate elements of social studies in that test. And then finally, validity and reliability. The approach is to leverage an existing state-specific assessment and work with the vendor to contextualize to North Carolina while maintaining that validity and reliability. So what's next? So in May, DPI will bring to PEPC a portfolio-based assessment aligned to the current evaluation standards for a vote. In June, with the recommendation from PEPC, the portfolio-based assessments will be advanced to the State Board of Education for consideration. And then short-term continued work, we will solidify recommendations for the internship requirements for principals and finalize work on revised principal standards and determine next steps. Long-range future work includes the revising the standards. Once the revised standards are approved, the evaluation instrument for North Carolina will need to be aligned to the new standards, and the portfolio-based assessment to the new standards. This is very important. Everyone needs to understand that this portfolio-based assessment that we're selecting will be aligned to the current principal standards. After we approve a new set of principal standards, then we will revisit that assessment to see if adjustments need to be made to capture anything in the revised standards. So this may not be the final word on the principal assessment, but it is the word that we need right now and to move forward to meet the statutory obligation. So I'm joined today by my colleague Tabari Wallace. He is much more able to answer questions around the impact of this work on the field and how principals are perceiving this, what the voices from the field have been in regard to our recommendation. I'm happy to stay here and answer any policy-related questions that you have, but that's where we are now, Chairman, and Tabari and I will be happy to answer any questions.
Questions?
I do have one question. So, Dr. Tomberlin, what I'm hearing is that this assessment will serve several purposes. One is there's going to be a decision made, right? And then the other one is more formative around areas for continuous improvement.
So yes, the decision that would be made is whether the candidate would receive a license. The formative aspect, I think, would go more towards the EPPs of continuously ensuring that their portfolio process supports the examination process. And again, DPI and the board, from my perspective, doesn't want to dictate to EPPs what they should or should not do, but we will provide the data back that lets them know how well their portfolios are promoting success on this instrument.
Yeah. And so that makes me think of, from a validity perspective, there's different claims and inferences based on whether you're looking at the formative component or that pass-fail. So I'm curious, with the different vendors that you're looking at, and knowing that you might want to tweak this a little bit to meet the needs here in North Carolina, for that decision and the validity of that decision, and knowing that you might want to tweak it a little bit, is that being considered in the process?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, and you know, in that chart, I think it was missed. The criteria, if you look down there where we're talking about scoring capacity, and that really should go to validity and reliability. This is compared to EdTPA. So those of you who remember how we rolled out the EdTPA, we had a soft rollout where a certain percentage of EPP candidates took the EdTPA. That gave us the opportunity to get scores. We could look at that in relation to, you know, and the EPPs could think about this, you know, is this my strongest candidate, and you know, where is this candidate in the distribution of my candidates that are taking this, and is this score lining up with my perceptions of how well prepared those folks are? We'll have to do something similar with this assessment. We don't know what that is right now. We have some strategies that are underway, but we'll be back. We'll certainly share those strategies with you, but there will need to be a period of time where we collect some data and examine how well the data are functioning for North Carolina. We can't just simply say it's valid in this state, so it's automatically going to be valid in our state. So we do have some plans in that regard. If you'll think about this, if you're adopting this in, let's say, June 15th, 2024, that's the date of the adoption, nobody really will, most people who complete their coursework by the end of the 24-25 school year will still be under the waiver. So you're going to have this period where the test is in effect, but the waiver still is in effect as well. So those folks will be held to that requirement. And that's the population that you really want to look at. Is there a way to get some information out of them that doesn't have any consequence that we can use for some of this testing? So it's a great question.
Also online, anyone that's online, do you have any questions? I just want to make sure. I just want a point of clarification that, that this could be done for the portfolio-based or performance-based assessment that the task force is considering could be done in a full-time or a part-time program. That would not have you wouldn't have to be in a full-time program to do this performance-based assessment.
I would think not, but you know, it's not clear to me how a part-time functions in terms of the range of opportunities it provides the intern. That's my reason for hedging on that. So I hear anecdotally that when people are doing a part-time internship, they're maintaining their teaching position, and so they're doing before or after school activities related to this. Insofar as that person can experience the full range of an administrator's job, they should be able to, but practically if that's not happening in the internship setting, then it could have some impact on how well they perform on that portfolio-based assessment.
What about certificate versus graduate program?
So you mean
Like the
like
certificate that's not the full,
license.
just the licensure only
just
program?
the licensure only, yeah. Will they have to follow these same requirements, or would it be adjusted for the fact that they're only doing a?
No, there would be the same requirements, and that's analogous to our teacher. I mean, when we have licensure only with teachers, they still have to pass the same assessments in order to hold the license. So I think that's something we're going to have serious conversations with our our LEAs and our PSUs about. Is we don't want to deny the part-time internship possibilities for folks, because we know that's very important for people. But if they need to be aware that if the candidate can't experience the full range of activities as articulated in the tasks of the assessments, then that's going to put them at a disadvantage.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I just say that because I'm working on my certificate right now, and so I've got to do 700 hours before December, and with being in the classroom, it is challenging to meet like the needs of my students, but then also get those internship hours. So I definitely think that there needs to be some sort of, like you're saying, clarification as far as like being able to meet. Luckily, because I'm virtual, I have a little bit more flexibility, but I think it's definitely like some of the students in my program with me are struggling just to get those current hours because they're doing both sides of it right now.
And I would be interested, Mr. Wallace probably has much more insight into how these part-time internships function than I do. So, Tabar, do you have any comment on that?
Yes, and it largely, good afternoon, everyone. I want to start with that, but it's largely, it's dependent upon the host principal. The host principal that the intern is working under, or the pre-service candidate is working under. Usually we make concessions if they're afforded the opportunity to do these tasks. Task one is largely PLC based, and we'll get into that next month when we do the full presentation, but task one is largely PLC based. And me as the host principal, having a teacher that's doing it part-time, I would make sure that candidate would be able to accomplish that task during their respective PLC, if you get what I'm saying. So there's a lot of latitude given to the pre-service candidate to get these tasks done. But that will be largely dependent on the host principal moving forward.
So I just want to say that that any EPP, or whether part-time or full-time, would need to show that they are meeting standards in their programs, right? So you could, to play devil's advocate, you could have a full-time intern that maybe doesn't have the opportunity to meet these tasks. So it's going to be a close look at the task to make sure that the internships are aligned. I don't want us to think that just because someone's part-time, that doesn't mean that they couldn't do this. It just means it's much harder.
Right.
Like anyone that goes to school and works full-time
Yeah.
for anything, right? It's absolutely very difficult, and a great commitment on the part of the candidate. But I also don't want us to start to think that that's not possible, when I think it is possible, because we don't want to lower the pipeline numbers.
I agree.
I do think, so there is a requirement that all, that partnership, when we're talking about principal preparation and the internships, there is a requirement for a memorandum of understanding between the EPP and the employee organization.
Yeah.
So this portfolio assessment could give you a real good roadmap on what the things that are agreed upon have to happen for these folks, regardless of whether it's part-time or full-time. So.
And we're not saying that Madison is sleeping anymore, but she is trying to get her hours in. So I think that there are quite a few part-time programs, and I know that PSUs in this room have hired those individuals, and many have become successful assistant principals and principals. So we just want to make sure, just like the teacher pipeline, and we have lots of options, that we have lots of options here, not to move it back to one pathway. Any other questions for Dr. Tomberlin?
I may have misunderstood earlier. Did you say that Tabari had feedback from those that are currently in the field about this recommendation?
Well, I'll let Mr. Wallace confirm or deny that statement.
Yes, on our task force, we have 3 assistant principals that serve, and then we have 3 principals that serve on our task force, 2 of them being the principals of the year. And during that work that we did when we were gauging this, we got a lot of feedback. But before next month's presentation, we have our principal summit 2 Mondays from now on April 22nd, and we plan to also solicit that feedback from all the principals of the year dating back to 2011.
I also will say that Mr. Wallace and Dr. Jordan and Dr. Tomberlin, et cetera, Dr. Seiberg, Dr. Evans, I could keep naming people, have had to do a lot of also breaking down misconceptions about what is happening. I think there's been some, you know how people get, I'm pretty dangerous when I have a little bit of information, so it's that type of thing that's been happening. So I think that some of the things that, one of the reasons I wanted this update today is because there are some, I see them as misconceptions about what's happening in this task force. And so we want to make sure that we're being clear with the public and with our educator prep programs and all that. And if they do have any questions, to come forward and contact whom, Dr. Tomberlin, if people do have questions.
As always, you may contact Dr. Andrew Seiberg with any questions.
Yes, if EPPs have questions, they can contact Dr. Seiberg. They also presented this at the EPP monthly call. They also presented this at the Human Resources monthly call. So we've been trying to also help them think about how to get the information out, because the task force has been working hard and working often. So Aaron has done a lot of facilitation of that. They've met both online and in person. Dr. Griffin and I both have been to at least 2 meetings. There's a couple more coming up. They're meeting every few weeks. So a lot of work. Thank you.
And Dr. Griffin, if your colleagues in the PSUs have questions, they can contact me.
Okay, yeah. So we do ask people to reach out if they think a certain thing or think that this is how it's gonna work, to get some clarification. And part of that is that they haven't brought forth their final recommendation, so it's a lot of, well, we're talking about, but we don't make the decision either. We make a recommendation to the state board. So some of this is the language being used around, like there hasn't been a decision being made yet. But there's been a lot of thoughtfulness, and Aaron in particular has done an excellent job facilitating that group. So thank you, Aaron. Thank you, Dr. Tomberlin.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wallace.
Thank you.
Okay, so now for the best part of our meeting. All right, so we're gonna have our three subcommittees present the work. I just want to remind if the listeners and educators online and people in the room that in December, we charged each of the subcommittees with work. I want to thank the subcommittees for their work. So in January, February, and March, subcommittees met at least once, sometimes twice, to move through. Two committees had charges of work to do. They all were charged with different work. And one of our subcommittees has a recommendation around something to add to the legislature items, or recommend to add to the legislation items of the state board. So we will begin with the licensure subcommittee, and the subcommittee chair or co-chairs, or one of the co-chairs will be presenting, and we'll be presenting from our seats.
The agenda was educator preparation first.
We can do ed prep first.
No,
Oh, the PowerPoint's already up.
The licensure.
all right, licensure is up.
I have it all in and ready, so I can replace.
I'm just following what Kim put in front of me. So, this is Ms. Hoskins and Dr. Blanton. And everybody else can just fan themselves. There's no air on the 7th floor of the DPI building, so thank you. Take it away.
All right, so licensure subcommittee met several times in order to address session law 2017-189 that deals with the GPA associated with educator preparation programs based on individual and cohort grade point averages for admission to EPPs. The second sentence of the work stream is the one that gave us the most concern. The commission shall consider which grade point average, either the grade point average in the content courses relevant to the licensure area, or the cumulative grade point average would be most appropriate for clinical residency students. And as an English teacher, if I ever thought that a two-letter word was going to give me as much heartburn as that particular word has
Yes.
done, I would have been very surprised. So we had conversation. The next slide really just goes over the definition of grade point average, and that's there just if we need to reference it as part of any discussion today. The next slide is the definition of clinical residency, also there just for reference purposes for folks who may need that additional background and support. We had some considerations as we worked through this difficult conversation process, which really wasn't difficult for us. It was just difficult to make sure that we took as many things into consideration as possible. So in order to maximize that flexibility without sacrificing the quality of candidates, which was of primary concern to all of us, was that maximizing flexibility without lowering the bar. We did consider that EPPs shall be the authoritative source for GPA calculation, subject to review by NCDPI. The folks at DPI were very clear that they do not want to become the GPA police, that they really want the EPPs to be monitoring that GPA calculation themselves. However, that second bullet, EPPs will need to have that documentation for their GPA calculation in the event that there is an audit or that somebody asks for that documentation, that there will need to be some process design around making sure that is in place. And then we had some healthy discussion around the minimum number of semester hours used to determine that GPA. And the two options that we kind of explored were the residency licensure, which requires 24 hours, and emergency licensure, which requires 18 hours. Before I get to the recommendation itself, Dr. Blanton, anything you want to add?
No, not much other than the emphasis on the word "or" there. That's kind of where a lot of the discussion centered on, and that's one thing we discussed, which I can't remember if we included in the recommendation or not, but just is there an avenue for changing that word "or" moving forward, because that is a problem in this case.
And the challenge is that there are EPPs who do it both ways. So there's great inconsistency, and so I think that the statute's intention is to bring a a certain level of consistency to how this particular rule is implemented. So we'll go ahead and go to the recommendation. So the licensure subcommittee recommends that EPP shall determine a GPA based on at least 18 semester hours of content coursework relevant to the area of licensure. The EPP shall have flexibility to determine the allowable content coursework, which is where we got into that flexibility. EPPs may consider content coursework from any official transcript, and if EPP candidates require remediation to their GPA, then they shall take content-related coursework external to EPP pedagogical requirements. So we did land on the content coursework relevant to the area of licensure, mostly because we felt that if someone wants to become a math teacher, they need to demonstrate math proficiency themselves as students. We need to make sure that we can stand behind that we have high-quality candidates who are proficient in the area of licensure that they are pursuing. We did think that having flexibility to determine what allowable coursework would be considered allows EPPs to have a little bit of flexibility and leeway in there. When we met with the EPP monthly webinar folks, they raised the question around whether the coursework could come from any official transcript or whether it had to come from a degreed transcript. And we sought legal help from DPI, and they were able to provide clarification that any official transcript would be great. And so someone who might go to a community college to boost their content coursework GPA could use those hours to be able to do so. We also felt that the need for that remediation opportunity for folks who might not actually come to an application process with the necessary GPA be given that opportunity to boost that GPA through additional coursework in order to get to the 18 hours of allowable content coursework related to their content area. That is our recommendation. Dr. Blanton, anything you want to add?
Very well said.
Would you say this is a motion? Yes, so we have a motion on the table. Do we have a second? We're gonna discuss it, but,
I think Dr. Fleming said if it comes out of committee, I don't know that it needs a second.
okay, thank you for that. Okay. Questions, clarifications?
Yeah, I'm really curious whether, with respect to, that they take content related, to, let's see, where am I, down in the last bullet point?
Yeah.
Yep, they should take content related coursework external to EPP pedagogical requirements. Has the issue of time to degree completion come up in that, in thinking through that?
So I'll be honest, and Alexandra may want to chime in on this too. I didn't have a real good understanding of that part of it coming from the K-12 world. That was more related to EPPs. Dr. Tomberlin was very helpful in discussing kind of why that was necessary, and I think that it related specifically to them running out of courses to take in EPPs if we weren't careful and didn't include that requirement in there. Dr. Tomberlin, I don't know if you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, yeah.
That was not an eloquent.
But it's, yeah, people are finishing their residency coursework but not having a GPA.
Right, this goes to these temporary licenses, so what we're finding are people are getting a permit to teach, getting an emergency license, they're enrolling in those EPPs, they're completing coursework prior to actually holding the residency, and when they do that, and they complete the coursework, the programmatic requirements, but they still have the testing requirements, that puts them in limbo that we can't get them out of. So what's happening is across the state is EPPs are having to design additional courses for them to take, which of course is an additional cost to the candidate. But because they haven't passed the test, we can't convert them over to an IPL, or we can't convert them to a CPL. So we're trying to use this policy language to avoid that problem. If you use content, if you use the pedagogical program requirements to remediate the GPA, then you're further exacerbating the problem, and that was the problem we were trying to solve there.
So what's the advantage of having that language versus just being silent on it, or keeping it even more open?
Because I believe if we keep it open, that they will take pedagogy courses and people will end up in the same spot. Because that's what's happening, right? And EPPs are having to figure out how to do some kind of extra courses because they have to be enrolled when they convert their license, and so it gets into a logistical issue. Instead of saying, if you don't have a GPA, then, and you're gonna be a math teacher, then your math GPA needs to be at a certain level, or your science, or your social studies. But you could go to the community college and take that because I'm just talking about practically. You can do that, and you could add that into the GPA. It doesn't have to be the GPA at the EPP. It doesn't have to be coursework at the EPP to create the GPA.
I think there are also candidates who do really well with pedagogical study, who do not necessarily do as well with content-related coursework. And so I think that what this does is ensure, again, that we have high-quality candidates.
I think the other piece for me is that we want to make sure that this is, the GPA is part of the admissions gateway to the residency license, right? That's what this policy is about. And so to do that, to say this is, and if they're elementary, it could be, a variety of things. So it gives the EPP the luxury to say, they could also replace a class. So you could say, okay, I took Calc 1 and I did not do well, but I could go back and take Calc 1 now, 20 years later, and I would probably do worse, but maybe better. But you could say, I'm going to take X class and replace it, and then you have that flexibility in the GPA if someone's close. Other questions or clarifications? This committee, I really appreciate this subcommittee because when Dr. Tomberlin and I showed up at one of their meetings, it's like, we were like, wait, no, So how is this gonna work? So we're trying to make it practical and flexible. That's the goal of all of these, right? Because these residency licenses have been in effect for a while. So now we're saying, okay, well, all of a sudden here's a new rule, but how can we make it as broad as we can, but also continue to hold standards around the quality of content that people know, the GPA that they have to be a teacher, a classroom teacher of record. I'm not saying it's perfect, but it's really good, and this subcommittee did a nice job. Any other thing that gives anyone pause? Anything from anyone online? Okay. I'll call for a vote. All those in favor of approving the recommendation from the licensure subcommittee to go forward to the state board at a later date this spring, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any Great. Any opposed? Any abstentions? All right. Thank you very, very much. You should be very proud of yourselves. It was a lot of work. Okay. Ed Prep.
Okay, so the first couple of slides, it'll be up here in just a second, just really say who was on our subcommittee and when we met. So if we can move to slide 4. What we were asked is a little bit complicated, so I felt like it was worth the time just to kind of point out exactly what we were asked to look at. So the first has to do with rules related to all aspects of educator prep programs that include requirements for appropriate pedagogy to be included in the residency license program. And then secondly, rules related to all aspects of professional standards for North Carolina educators, with specific hour requirements for both pre-service training and field experiences prior to entering the classroom for the residency license, and pre-service training prior to entering the classroom for individuals issued emergency license. So like others, where there were words like or, prior to entering the classroom was something that we talked a lot about. So if we go on to the next slide, you have our recommendations, and I'm going to take this in two parts, so the 1A and 2A first, and see what questions folks may have, and then we'll go to the second one. So for the first one, requirements for appropriate pedagogy in the residency licensure programs, if we look at slides 6, 7, and 8, which we'll look at those here in just a second, those are from Session Law 2017-189, and those were the content and pedagogy requirements put out for all EPPs. Kim, if you want to kind of scroll through those slides for people to see, there are 4 major areas in those requirements. The first is just general instruction. The second is training for specific to elementary education teachers. The third is training for elementary education and special ed general curriculum related to early literacy intervention strategies. And the fourth is for middle and high school teachers. And so we felt strongly that these were already laid out as requirements for EPPs. It made sense that these should be part of the programs for residency license programs. And then the second part of that one is the 2A. We said at least 3 hours of field experience prior to entering the classroom and a minimum of 10 hours during the first year. We looked at a lot of different documents. There already are some clear guidelines for PSUs around a set of 10 things that they must provide to the residency licensure folks. We talked a lot about number of hours and sort of what our desire would be, but then also what could be realistic in this situation, and that's how we landed on these. So I'll pause there before we move on to the second part.
Questions or clarifications?
Okay, great. So for 2A and B, we were to consider those hours. So for residency licensure, emergency licensure, and any other temporary licenses, we felt that candidates should receive at least 8 hours of instruction in the following. Again, large discussions around all the things that we felt were truly important, but this is really where we landed. The first, the Every Student Succeeds Act very clearly goes through some evidence-based practices. We felt those should be included first. The second is instruction in whole school, whole community, whole child. This model really focuses on the connections between health and academic achievement, the importance of social emotional learning. There's a great NCDPI link that gives a whole set of options for professional development, including things like mental health first aid and other options. So it's not just one specific thing. There really are an array of ways that this could be met. The third is positive management of student behavior and effective communication techniques for diffusing and de-escalating disruptive or dangerous behaviors. And then the fourth is enrollment in state-required trainings that are instructed by the PSU. So a good example of that right now would be science of reading and the letters training that teachers are required to do. So this would keep the door open for those specific and required trainings that are happening at any given time. And that's it. Those are the two sort of separate pieces of that.
Okay. Questions or clarifications overall?
And that's prior to entering the classroom?
Correct.
Yes,
Well,
so
at
that's
least
3
8 hours prior to entering the classroom, and the feeling was with these 4 areas, they could get at least some instruction in each of these 4 areas. So think things like, if you've ever been involved in beginning teacher trainings in the first few days before school, or other online modules for late hires, which of course is becoming more and more common now, things along those lines.
Okay. That was my question. So online trainings certainly could suffice for meeting the credentials of those 8 hours.
Correct. And there are lots of already available things out there.
And I just also want to note that it says at least, because a district might say, or PSU might say, well, we require 20 hours. Great, that's fine, right?
Yes.
It's at least.
And number 4 is an enrollment in those trainings. It's not you complete letters before you enter the classroom, which wouldn't be possible.
Right. So again, trying to provide rigor yet flexibility in terms of residency teachers are being hired every day, I would say. And so we're trying to think about what's practical, yet what focus areas we would want them to have to recommend to the state board. Okay.
The language to the extent possible at the beginning of that, I guess you see.
So,
That's it.
oftentimes when someone's approved on some kind of, and please, PSU folks, please speak up, but part of the conversation was around people hired in an emergency situation, a temporary license. They may literally be hired and going to work the next day. And so it would be this is ongoing. You're starting and you're doing these things. That's not the way we would desire for it to happen, and I'm probably sure it's also not the way the person would desire for it to happen, but yeah.
That was kind of my question is these licenses and filling spots is an ongoing process constantly, and it would require almost a full-time person to train constantly. But if there's leniency within producing those modules and getting those persons in, because, people want those vacancies filled as quick as they possibly can.
And I think we've seen people really react to this over the years, the EPPs, the RESAs, NCAT. We used to all have those early days, beginning teacher training, and that was the end of that. We all now work together and have late hire trainings and develop things that can happen over time. So it's that same kind of thinking.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense.
Again, practical. I mean, someone in the PSU will have to keep, just like they do now as part of the beginning teacher program, keep up. Just like EPPs are gonna have to keep up with the GPA, the courses. There could be an audit. We talked about this, that we feel like that GPAs on the first recommendation that from the licensure subcommittee, that, that EPPs will have to keep like a sheet that says, Chris Blanton this was his GPAs, how we managed it. He took these 2 classes to raise it, et cetera, whatever happened. So if you're ever asked by a licensure or audited, in a sense, that you have a record of that. And I think this will be the same, but you have to do that anyway, correct? Like human resources generally is in charge of that in most PSUs. So you would have to say, yes, I confirm this person had at least 8 hours, and it wasn't 2 years later, right? Because it's only gonna help them, right? Okay, so we have a motion from the Educator Preparation Subcommittee. Thank you very much for your hard work. This language makes it, to think about it in reality, is a large task, and it's been a lot of work. So I will call the question for the vote for this recommendation. All those in favor of approving the recommendation around, what am I gonna call this? Training for residency licensure prior to teaching. Does that sound? All those are in favor of this recommendation for the licensure subcommittee around required training, say aye. Please signify by saying aye. Any opposed? Any abstentions? Recommendation moves forward. Again, this won't go on May at the state board because they just don't have room on their agenda. Okay. Our last subcommittee is assessment and performance. This is a recommendation around something to add to the legislature agenda for the state board. That will be what we will be recommending here, if approved.
Kim, are you driving?
I'm driving.
Hey everyone, I wonder if we can go to the first slide. I just want to thank the committee members, Tracy, Ida, Connie, Scott, and Anthony. This was a big one, and it took a little bit of time to get through, so I'm grateful for all their efforts. flip the script a little bit and not share a recommendation until the end. I want to take you on the journey that the committee went on and share with you information that the committee reviewed. But first, Kim, I wonder if we go to the next slide here. It's really hard to see up there, but this has to do with the Praxis Core requirement. Per legislation, you cannot admit into an undergrad licensure program unless they've either passed all 3 sections of the Praxis Core or have an aggregate score across the 3 that reaches a certain threshold. There's a waiver of that requirement if you obtain certain scores on either the ACT or SAT. The charge for this subcommittee is to bring forth a recommendation for discussion to Pepsi related to the repeal of this component of the statute related to the Praxis Core and related evidence to support this repeal. Kim, can we go to the next slide? Timeline similar to the other subcommittees. We had several meetings as a group, and that landed us here. Kim, I think we can move on. So here, remember again, not showing the recommendation yet, but this is the journey that we went on. And I'll speak to a few of these points, and then the smaller bullet points under rationale for the recommendation, those we'll go into in a little more detail. These are some of the things that the subcommittee talked about. First, we talked about, when you're talking about the Praxis Core, are we also talking about the SAT and ACT score and the waiver that came with it? So when we put forth a recommendation, is that recommendation just going to be about the Praxis Core? Or would the recommendation also be a repeal of the use of any other assessment as well, such as the SAT or ACT? So we talked about that, and you'll see how that panned out in the recommendation. We did get some feedback from ETS, and we read through that feedback and considered it as well in our deliberations. And this has to do with, primarily from a validity perspective, the relationship between the Praxis Core scores and then content tests for licensure. Another issue that we considered is, do we retain Praxis Core but not use it to make a decision as to whether or not you can enter the program or not, but use it more diagnostically? So something that we considered as well. Then we considered getting down to the smaller data points, and Kim, I'm going to have you walk us through some of the slides here. Considerations, and we worked closely with our friends here at DPI on gathering data around this. One issue is the barrier to admission. We actually have sort of a natural experiment in North Carolina, because with the pandemic, that requirement of the Praxis Core was waived for a year. So working with Andy Baxter, we have data, and you can see the graph up here as to what happened to enrollments in our EPPs. That spike up after the 35%, that's when we removed the requirement of the Praxis Core for that 1 year. So you can see we had a 35% increase when we removed it. I don't know that we can speak about causality here, right? And yet, right, something happened, right? So an increase of 35%, and then you can see when that waiver went away and Praxis Core was required again, you can see what followed. Again, not speaking causality here, but the relationship is there, and then that downward trend continued into the next year. All right. So this gives us, this is evidence with respect to it being a barrier to admission. When we remove that barrier, admission spiked way up. The next one is, Kim, I think we can go to the next slide after that graph, and this is going to be really hard to see, so I'm going to walk you through what's up here. This is, we looked at 2 years. The year that the waiver was given, which I believe was 2021, and then the year prior to that, 1920. And so that's the sample that we're using for a series of analyses that were run to look at the relationship between Praxis Core outcome and then other outcomes. What this this figure shows, and really what I'm speaking to is the one on the left, even though I know you probably can't see either the one on the left or the one on the right, is down the columns, there we go. The rows pertain to race, ethnicity, identity. The columns pertain to outcomes related to the waiver status for the praxis course. So the first column is that you passed praxis core on each section. The second column is that you had a passing score on the praxis core, etc. Here's what I want to bring your attention to. Kim, are we able to scroll down just a little bit more to get the bottom? If you look at the total, you will see that 7.1, the bottom line there where it says 7.1, that's 7.1% of all individuals failed the praxis core. So these are individuals who are relying on the praxis core to meet that requirement, meaning they didn't meet it by the ACT or SAT per se. Of all the individuals, 6,519, 7.1% failed the praxis core. You can then see 13.79 passed each section, and 18.96 met that requirement by having the total summated score meet the threshold. Now let's compare that to some other groups, right? Let's go up, just one up to those identifying as white. Those who failed the praxis core represented 5.6%. Of those who identified white, 5.6% failed the praxis core, 14.46 passed each section, 18.5% had an aggregate score that passed. Now I want to take you to a different racial identity group. Can you go up to the Black African American, which is the second row? Now the third row down, you will see 16.64% of the Black African American candidates failed the praxis core. And you can see other groups in there as well. You can slice this another way, and this is just calculations that I've done using these data. If you take the first three columns and add them together, those are the individuals who use the praxis core to gain entry or not gain entry into the licensure program, meaning they didn't have that requirement waived by virtue of meeting on the ACT or SAT or ACT. For the Black group, of those who use the praxis core, meaning the first three columns, those identifying as Black, that's 16.64%. Well, that's of the total. But if you take the 127 individuals, Kim, are you able to circle that 127? That's above the 16.64%. That actually represents, let me go to my notes here, give me 1 second here. Sorry about this. 34%. So of all the candidates who identified as Black or African American who relied on the praxis core when applying to the EPP, that's the summation of the 80, the 166, and the 127. 127 failed, didn't have a passing score, and that represents 34% of all those who use the praxis core as an entry point. If you contrast that, for example, to those who identify as white, we see it's a much smaller percentage. It is 14.5%. So this, just trying to slice it and dice it for you. The implication of this is that we do feel that it's hindering the diversification of the teacher pipeline. Right? Clear as mud, right? Kim, I want to go back to the slide of considerations here. The third bullet point down is that when you look at the relationship of whether or not you pass the praxis core or not for these 2 years of sample, that's 19, 20, and 20 and 21, and you relate it then to later measures of program completion and teacher effectiveness, the only thing that whether or not you pass the praxis core is related to are the licensure content exams. I want to show you what it's not related to. And Kim, if you can scroll down to Andy Baxter's diagram here. Keep going. There we go. Here's what it's not related to. It's that middle box in the blue. So when you look at did you pass the praxis core or not, it's not related to whether or not you completed the EPP. It's not related to the pedagogy exam at DPA, for example. It's not related to whether or not you teach in a school within a year of completion. It's not related to supervisors' ratings of satisfactory ratings. It's not related to receiving an evaluation of proficiency, nor is it related to EBOS scores. The one thing that it is related to is whether or not you pass the content license exams. So, all right. In addition to that, there are other states who, I'm just going to go through a few points quickly here, that having an assessment of this nature being required for licensure programs has been dropped by other states. So we're not alone in considering this. You'll notice that there's an inconsistency within North Carolina in our own requirements, right? It's a requirement for the undergrad, but not for other alternative licensure routes. And I think we all have examples out there of highly effective teachers who were either unsuccessful in passing the praxis core or did not have to because of the licensure route that they took. All right, so with all of that then, Kim, can we please go to the slide that has our recommendation? The Pepsi Assessment and Performance Subcommittee recommends the removal of the praxis core or any other equivalent assessment substitution, meaning ACT or SAT, etc., okay, as a requirement for admission into teacher preparation programs, and the rationales are what I have just described. Thank you for going on that journey with me. Our subcommittee members, have I left out anything?
Thank you, Dr. Penfield. Questions? Comments?
Not a question, but a comment. The third bullet down where there's no significant relationship to the outcomes and effectiveness, especially as it's linked to EBOS, that's powerful.
Another comment I would make, the percentage we saw was across the state, but for some of the EPPs, probably in particular the regional comprehensive EPPs, HBCUs, the rate of an increase in admission into our program was way above that. I mean, we're talking upwards of 100% increase in admissions in that semester. And then as Randy was talking about also, there are already all kinds of sort of intervention services that EPPs already do put in place and certainly can continue to do so. Workshopping, access to software, online modules, practice exams, all kinds of things to help those who need that help for the content licensure at the end of the program.
Any comments or questions from our colleagues online?
I will follow up on Dr. Penfield's point to say that I do sit here as the state teacher of the year. I did not take the praxis based on my licensure path. I had an undergraduate degree in my content area. I took the GRE for admission to my graduate program, but at no point did I take the praxis, and it has in no way correlated to my growth as a teacher leader, my EBOS data, or the outcomes of my students. So that correlative fact is simply not there.
Right, and the GRE was not used at all in your licensure path. That was just to get to grad school.
To get to grad school.
Yeah.
That was the only formative assessment I took. Now also to the recommendation of our previous committee, the GPA requirements are still there. Like, our students are still gonna have to perform in their field, and I think that's far more significant to high-quality instructors.
Thank you. Dr. Tomberlin?
Yes, Chairman, I believe you said it, but I might have missed it. This one in particular has to be a recommendation for statutory change, not
Correct.
State Board of
For the legislature item, for a legislative item, yeah. Any other comments?
So will he be able to present to the legislature all that data? Because as a math teacher, I'm loving it. I mean, it's impressive.
So, when this goes forward to state board, we don't, as a ask to be on the legislature agenda for them, we haven't discussed how that will happen. Sometimes it's the DPI staff and sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's us. So we'll, and sometimes it's both, right? So I imagine with these recommendations, we have not discussed this, so this is Ann's opinion. Ann's opinion would be that this would probably at least be a co-piece, if not, they might, you know, so we'll discuss that. Don't, and anybody will be there to, I will be at that to answer any questions, and anyone on the commission is welcome to come at any point to a state board meeting. They're open. So, does that sound fair, DPI staff? They're like, yes, y'all please do it. Okay. All right, so we have a recommendation to ask for the assessment and pedagogy, assessment and performance committee recommendation to be recommended to be on the state board legislature agenda. And I want to thank this subcommittee. This was a ton of work, and it's effectively and efficiently presented in a way that is easy to understand. And thank you for thinking about it from many different viewpoints. It's really, really well done. Really, really well done. So the motion is to recommend that this go on the legislature agenda, or to ask for it to be on the legislature agenda for the state board. So I will call for a vote. All those who are in favor of the recommendation that I just said, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any opposed? Any abstentions? Very good. All right, thank you. I just want to stop again, I know I've said it like 3 times, and thank the subcommittees, because the bulk of our work in the 23-24, which is how I determine an academic year, school year, has been around our subcommittee work. And the fact that this commission took this work with high integrity and high purpose to come up with recommendations that were broad yet had rigor to them is very exciting to see. And the fact that we finally have completed recommendations from 2017 is also very exciting to see. When they brought those forward and said, we need to work on these, I'm like, what? Okay, so that's been really good. So thank you, Dr. Evans, and Dr. Tomberlin, Dr. Thaberg, for bringing those forward to us to work on, and for us to be able to check that off and take those forward. Again, I will mention that the state board agenda for May, we've heard, is full because it's a one-day meeting, so these things probably won't go till the beginning of June. We don't quite know.
You updated on that.
Yeah, we'll keep us updated, just so everyone knows that in terms. Okay. All right, so I want to first thank everybody for your patience with me being in person and it feeling very different in my Robert's Rule of Order things that I have not done quite correctly today. So thank you for your patience with me as your chair. I also want to remind everyone that we anticipate that the principal standards performance-based assessment piece will come in May. It will come. They will be ready. That will be a discussion, and we need to pay particular attention because we want to make sure we catch anything before it goes forward. And officially, thank you, commission members, advisors, and staff for your preparation for the discussions today. I remind commission members that our next monthly meeting will be held in a hybrid manner in person in the 7th floor of the State Board of Education boardroom, as well as virtually on Thursday, May 9th, time to be determined. We have now completed our meeting, and unless there is additional business at this time, I ask for a motion to adjourn. Thank you, Madison. A second.
Second.
Thank you, Dr. Fleming. All those in favor of adjourning, please say aye. Any opposed? Any opposed to adjournment? Motion carries.
Can I just make one announcement that Ms. Jones brought to my attention, and I also knew that there is a possibility that this room will be renovated during the next meeting, so it would be held in 150 downstairs on the
Okay.
first floor.
Somewhere in the building,
Yes.
150.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Perhaps they have air conditioning. Yes, so, all right, thank you very much. We are adjourned.
Brandon, great job. That was a lot of work.
Oh, I don't know, I didn't ask anybody to work to the agenda.